You're all so quiet. What are you expecting? Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to the city of Copenhagen for inviting us. My name is Paul Holdengräber. I'm the Director of Public Programs at the New York Public Library, where I often say my goal is to make the lions roar. We have 2 lions in front of the library called Patience and Fortitude. So my goal there is to make them roar and to make that heavy institution levitate. It would seem that Denmark is very much on my mind for the moment. It's nearly become a second homeland. I just was at the UN opening the Trusteeship Council chamber. As you may know, Caspar Salto and Thomas Sigsgaard redid chairs for the chamber, and it was complicated because there used to be 92 members and now there are 193 members, and the shapes of people have changed. But they had to do it in the style of Finjul, so I know how to say Finjul now. I would like to thank Lisebach Hansen very, very much for inviting us here today and for taking this risk of speaking about Kierkegaard. I'm trying to pronounce him correctly too. And it's a great pleasure to have Pascal Bruckner here.
For me too.
We've known each other for many, many years, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about your rediscovery of Kierkegaard. But in order to do this, I think it's appropriate for me to begin with a quotation from Kierkegaard, from his journals. Listen carefully. It will give you a sense also of the style of Kierkegaard, and then I'll have Pascal react to it. Maybe I'll read it from the anthology here. From his journals. It's called A Sad Reflection. In one of the Psalms, it is said of the rich man that he heaps up treasures with great toil and knoweth not who shall inherit them. So I shall leave behind me, intellectually speaking, a capital by no means insignificant, and alas, I know full well who will be my heir, mon héritier. It is that figure, so exceedingly distasteful to me, that till now has inherited all the best and will continue to do so, the docent, the professor. Yet this also is a necessary part of my suffering, to know this and then go calmly on with my endeavor, which brings me toil and trouble, and the profit of which, in one sense, the professor will inherit. In one sense, for in another sense, I take it with me. And then Kierkegaard puts this note. And even if the professor should chance to read this, it will not give him pause, and will not cause his conscience to smite him. No, this too will be the subject of a lecture. And again, this observation, if the professor should chance to read it, do you understand me? This will not give him pause. No, this too will become the subject of a lecture. For longer even than the tapeworm, which recently was extracted from a woman, even longer is the professor, and the man in whom the professor is lodged cannot be rid by any power. Only God can do it if the man himself is willing. So in some sense, Kierkegaard will always be the inspiration against his better judgment for professors.
Yes, so we'll try not to act as professors tonight.
Yes, exactly.
And to act as an ordinary readers. And through the quotation you just made, we understand that Kierkegaard is quite difficult to understand. It seems at first...
And this was an easy quotation.
Yeah, I know, you could have
I mean,
found,
I chose something really easy to read.
I know. Even me, I could understand. So, but yes, at a first look, Kierkegaard seems a very simple philosopher, nothing to do with a German idealist. And when you go deeper into his work, then it becomes darker and darker. And the more you read, and the less you understand. And in this quotation, there are many aspects, of course. His hatred of university. As you know, Kierkegaard was never a professor, nor a husband, nor a preacher, nor a reverend. So he spent his life...
He was mainly not.
Yes. He didn't want to become anything like this. But there is a last touch of pride when he says that only God could understand him. And it reminds me of a sentence which is attributed to Hegel. It is said that when Hegel died at the end of his life, on his deathbed, he said, "Nobody has read me, and those who read me did not understand me," which is maybe true. But in fact, in this sentence you quoted, Kierkegaard is closer to Hegel than he thought.
He wouldn't have liked that.
No, he wouldn't have liked that, but he's not here anymore, so he cannot contradict us.
Yeah.
Yes.
But Kierkegaard, your relationship to him, I'm curious about this, because you said he is so difficult to read. And you, in preparation of this afternoon, I have subjected you
to an intense reading
of Kierkegaard.
Yes, I had to.
And so, tell me how you feel.
Well, I feel well now, being here with you in Copehagen, a city which I like very much. But in my youth, for the people of my generations, Kierkegaard was used as a tool against the dominance of Marxism. So, in the 60s and 70s, it was not Hegel who was the dominant philosopher, it was Marx. And the existentialist current used Kierkegaard to contradict this power of Marxism, which was saying nearly the same thing as Hegel. We are all parts of a history that passes us, and our personal destiny do not have any importance. So we don't have to consider the individual, we have to consider the movement which leads, that's what the people thought at this time, invariably from capitalism to communism. And if people like Jaspers, Hannah Arendt, Sartre elected Kierkegaard as the founding father of existentialism, and in fact it's a retrospect election, because the word existentialism appears for the first time in a letter which Jaspers wrote to Hannah Arendt in 1937. And so it's a kind of consecration, but post-mortem.
So Kierkegaard didn't know he was an existentialist?
No, he didn't know that. No. He thought he was just a suffering Danish Christian struggling against the official church. So when Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and many others elected Kierkegaard as...
to a club that they belonged to.
Yes, as a master, as a precursor. They tried to revive the importance of the individual against a system that was inclined to globalize them. And exactly as Kierkegaard didn't want to be déjà vu by the Hegel system, we didn't want to be counted for nothing into the communist intelligentsia. So he was,
as a quotation I mentioned at the beginning, Kierkegaard is always recuperated.
Yes, always. That's his destiny. And that's the best thing you can imagine for a philosopher and for a writer. So until the 60s, Kierkegaard was just the object of professors. Unfortunately, he was worshipped by scholars and university. And then his works have been published in France in pocket books. How do you say?
Livre de poche.
Livre de poche.
No, but pocket books is that's
pocket
right.
Books, yes, thank you.
You actually say
yes.
Pocket books.
Yes, thank you for translating my English.
I am trying.
Yeah. And then he became accessible to every kind of reader. And you know the strength of this philosophy, which is in fact an anti-philosophy. The strength is that it applies to everyday subject, Diary of a Seducer, the concept of anguish, Treaty of Despair. That was something which was speaking to us immediately. We didn't have to deal with heavy German idealism, which is, of course, also magnificent, but so magnificent that we disappear as a reader into the pages. Kierkegaard was like a grand brother speaking to each of us. You have problem with seduction, you have problem with your anxiety, you have problems with your freedom, you're sometimes tempted by despair. Read my book, and I will give you not an answer, but at least I will give you
a good question.
Good question, and a guide to move into your life. And that explains his immense success during those years. And it explains also why I hope we are going to read him again today that we celebrate his bicentennial.
But to go back a tiny little bit to the period in which you read him intensely, you were brought up, as it were. I mean, the world that mattered to you was precisely that world of existentialism, and you were saying, you know, that he didn't know. And I'm reminded, when you say this, of the fantastic line by Borges, who says that every writer creates his own precursors. And in some way, Kierkegaard created his whole destiny, as it were, destiny of future readers. And in Gabriel Marcel, in Jaspers, in Hannah Arendt, in Sartre, he found his best heirs. Or did he not?
Yes, absolutely. Heirs and traitors also.
Traitors?
Yes, traitors, yes, because...
not treasures, traitors.
Traitors. So
traitors,
people who betrayed him. But you know, I think this is also the destiny of a writer, is to be betrayed when you are being read by people after you.
But you know, I wonder, when you say traitor, I also wonder about translation, because you know the famous line, yes. Traductore, traditore, traitor, translator. And I wonder, what it is like. I know that Siri Hustvedt reads Kierkegaard in Danish. Yes. And I just wonder how much we gain or lose in translation. Because I must say, rereading Kierkegaard for me, in small dosage, not big. I do not suggest reading him for 10 consecutive days as I've done. It's really not very good for you. But if you read him for a while, he is really pleasurable. He writes so beautifully.
Oh yes.
I mean, he's a great stylist.
Yes, that's why also why the French love him. It's because he's a literary man. He's been brilliant in treatises, in poetry, in novels, in philosophy, and doesn't have these heavy writing of German philosophy, Kant, Hegel, Schlegel, Schelling, and all those, Heidegger, of course, which is the most difficult to understand, even in German. So I'm quite happy to read Kierkegaard in French, because in French he's already very difficult to understand. I think in Danish it would be impossible for me to get a line.
No, we're lucky.
Yes, we were lucky.
Yeah.
So I have no way to test the quality of the translation. I don't know if it's good or bad, but I compared a few translations made by different translators, and it fits. It fits, 20 years after, 30 years after, it does fit.
Well, he's very, in that way, by saying it fits, it also means that he's very urgent. He's very modern in some way.
Yes, he's very urgent, especially in small aphorism, which he uses. And we remember Kierkegaard not through his system, because in fact doesn't have a system, or he changed systems during his life. But he made many beautiful lines which we love to remember.
What line do you love to remember?
Oh, for instance, he said, I want, give me some possible or I suffocate. It's not, I'm not giving the exact quotation.
Well, we'll soon be speaking about one line that will project, that you've probably seen, about the infinite possibility. Why does that line touch you?
Oh, it touches me because when you're a teenager, when you're 16 or 17, and you are yourself suffocating under the yoke of a family, of a milieu, of religion.
Did you suffocate from religion?
Oh yes, definitely. I was brought up in the Catholic religion, which was at this time, not anymore because now Christianity is disappearing from France. But of course, you know, I was living in the French province, in Lyon, in the 60s, and life was not exactly as brilliant as it is today. So Kierkegaard was for me one of the doors which opened on the outside world. And
what did he show you? What did he, when you looked through that window, what did you see?
He said something very simple, but which still remains essential. He said that, and then all the existentialist philosophy reprised it. He said that freedom is always related to anguish. There cannot be freedom without anguish, and there cannot be anguish without freedom.
And it's so interesting to think of the word anguish itself, which literally means to have one's throat be tight.
Yes, exactly. Your throat is being tight, but your chest is breathing again. So, you know, he was one of those leaders which took me out with many others, out of oppression, out of mediocrity, out of everyday life, which is exactly what you require from a writer when you're a young man, even when you're an older man.
An older man. I'd like to remember this sentence that a writer, and in this particular case, let's consider Kierkegaard first and foremost, perhaps a great writer, takes you out of mediocrity.
Yes, yes.
I mean, very few things do that.
No, very
and
few.
It's putting a lot of hope in the power of words and literature to believe they can do that.
Yes, if people ever read again, which is the most important issue nowadays, you know, less and less people are reading books, at least in France, but I guess it's the same in all over Europe. But if you have the chance to read him,
if you risk reading,
if you do the effort to open a book and not only play on your screen, you might have.
But you might be able to play on the screen
yes,
and read Kierkegaard.
Yes, you might have the happy surprise to be taken away from your own personal life, which is always in a way a jail. We are in jail in ourselves. So Kierkegaard opens a window, and for this reason, I'm very grateful to him.
What do you think he would make of this meeting?
Oh, I think he would be at the same time extremely flattered and extremely disappointed. He would hate us all, and that's the particularity of Kierkegaard. So whenever he has a stand, he immediately jumps to the opposite side. You know, you can never catch him and say that's his philosophy. No, because he's already somewhere else. He's always running from one point to the other.
So he's kind of taking us by surprise from behind.
Yeah, from behind or from
every side.
From every side. But that's why he makes an analogy of possibility, because he never wants to be caught into a system. He always evades any kind of definition.
But I think he would be pleased somewhat that non-professors are speaking about him. At least we are speaking about him in a non-professorial way. And then we'll have René Redzepi come here and talk to us in yet another way about him. So in some way, the urgency that he was hoping for and the posthumous fame, I mean, he was interested in people reading him later. So at least we've given him that. You have said in an essay on Kierkegaard that he renounced life, and that it is in some way a core of his philosophy. And you also say that in the title of the essay, you say that he is a Christ who is a dandy. I love, which I find fabulous. I was trying to understand what both of these terms might mean, and what it means for him to have renounced life. And I might quickly add, because all of this could fit quite comfortably in a good answer of yours, that you create kind of a lineage for Kierkegaard. ancestors and followers. The followers, the most recent followers, we've spoken about, and there's some that are even reading Kierkegaard in France and elsewhere today. But you create Amiel, who wrote a journal of about 10,000 pages, Goncharov, who wrote one very important book, Oblomov, with a character that's strictly speaking nothing, and Kierkegaard himself in that as an heir to those two, and then Melville, and particularly in Melville, my single favorite short story of his, which is Bartleby, where he famously says, "I would prefer not to."
Oh, that's a huge question.
Okay,
so
I will give you a huge amount of time.
Yes.
Go.
So Kierkegaard said one time to his secretary, Levine, he told him how lucky you are to be Jewish, because if I were not born in Christianity, I would probably have lived a life. And so we have to remember that the fate of Kierkegaard is closely related to sacrifice. There is an anecdote which every Kierkegaard reader knows and which is good to remember. When his father was a young shepherd in Jutland, a very poor area of Denmark at this time, he was 12, and one day he spoke to God and said, "Why did you choose for me such a miserable fate?" It was like a curse. And so he showed his anger against God. And a few years after, he was summoned in Copehagen by one of his uncles, and he made a fortune in selling caps and buttons and clothes. And he saw his fortune not as a sign of blessing, but as a sign of curse, which is, of course, very interesting, because most of the rich people think they have been elected by God and not cursed by God. But this feeling of curse has been transmitted to his own children. And Kierkegaard always thought, Søren Kierkegaard always thought that he would die before 33, because I think he lost 5 or 6 of his brothers and sisters. Yeah. He lost his mother. And so he always thought that he was predestined to an early death. And that's why I think you said it in your presentation, that's why he was more related to his father than to his mother. And so he decided very early.
His mother is nearly absent.
Yes, his mother is totally absent. So that's why he thought of himself at the very beginning of his life that he was to be sacrificing himself to the sin of his own father. And that's why he decided, and the journal shows it extremely precisely, that he was the man to whom nothing ever would happen. And
what does that mean?
That means that he failed in every domain. He failed.
You speak about the vitality of failure.
Yeah, exactly. The vitality, the pleasure of failing. And that he failed to become a professor. He failed
to be a lover, a husband.
Of course, he could never marry Regine Olsen. He failed to be a preacher. He failed to be a reverend. And his only energy was invested in writing. And that's why he's so interesting. When you read, for instance, the Diary of the Seducer, you think it will be like libertine book in the same style as Coderlo de la Clos or Casanova.
Do you remember the cover in the Livre de Poche? It was a very intense man looking at you in the French edition.
Yes, and
I remember being 15 or 16 and getting that book and reading it on the beach and thinking, wow, this might help. But
yes, exactly.
But
and you know, this intense man, it's funny you said that this intense man looks like those posters in America, Uncle Sam wants you.
Yeah.
And this intense man was saying, you can do it if I can do it. So we opened this book with quite expectation and febrility. And in fact, it has very little to do with seduction, very little to do with women. It is just a pure mental exercise. And it's interesting to notice that Kierkegaard, in spite of his disgust for official philosophy, especially German philosophy, continues a line which starts with Descartes, Leibniz, Kant, and then Nietzsche, of virginity, as if philosophers were forming a long line of priests dedicated to the deity of virginity, as if a philosopher to exist had not to commit himself with the pleasures of the flesh. And that's very interesting, because I think Nietzsche somewhere says philosophers should abhor marriage, and the only one who with an
abhor
exception,
meaning hate marriage.
Hate marriage.
Yeah.
The only exception to that was Socrates, and that's why he married an ugly wife, and a very angry wife. He's the exception that confirms
So this
the rule.
isn't very promising for philosophers.
No, but
No.
I think this kind of attitude may have changed in the 20th century, and especially in the 21st. But
So giving away the pleasures of the flesh.
Giving away, yes. The only pleasure in which Kierkegaard indulged when he was young was the pleasure of cooking. He was going in nice restaurants. He was dressed elegantly. That's why I called him a dandy Christ. He didn't have any money problems because his father left him a huge fortune, which he of course, wasted away because he never worked.
So is that the dandy part?
Yes, that's the dandy part, of course. But so Kierkegaard, for me, is a philosopher of the dodging of life. How to avoid any kind of commitment in everyday life. And that's what makes him very interesting. And maybe the founding stone of a new lineage, which you mentioned before, like Amiel, who was with him in Berlin in, I think, 1840. And for those who do not know Amiel, and nobody knows him, not even in France, as you say, he's a writer of a huge diary of 16,000 pages. 16,000 pages. And it's a diary.
So it's 5 times the length of La Recherche.
Yes, yes, but not with exactly with the same interest. And why is it interesting in spite of this? It's because Amiel, like Kierkegaard and many others after him, discover a new dimension of reality, which appears in the 19th century, which is banality. This kind of new dimensions of the time. How to live when nothing happens to you, when every day looks like the previous one and looks like the next one. And this dimension of banality is really relevant in Amiel's diary, which is a long notation about the weather in Geneva, his small pains in his body, his meetings with people. And every day he writes. It's like...
So he keeps a journal of his temperament.
Yes, and it's a huge monument to nothingness, which is fascinating.
I think you should go out and buy it immediately.
Yes. It's a huge monument to nothingness. And Kierkegaard has replaced nothingness by the prolific and wonderful work of reflection upon every aspect of life. But then, in fact, you also quoted Oblomov, the hero of Goncharov. And Oblomov is this man in Goncharov's novel who decided that his life started with extinction, and who decided when he was very young to remain in his bed and never to move out of the sweetness of the blankets and sheets.
It made me think that another person we could put in this pantheon you have constructed is Huysmans, des Esseintes in Arrebourg, who also spends his life encased, having servants wearing slippers that make no noise, having a turtle in his home on which he encrusts diamonds, living a totally aesthetical life. The aesthetical life, I bring it up in part because you were saying there was a repudiation of it in Kierkegaard, and yet he had such an incredible love of opera, and he had an incredible love of Don Giovanni, which you heard as you walked in. I'd like us to look at, for a very brief time, the catalogue scene, and for you to comment on that particular moment in Don Giovanni, if we could look at it.
Well, it's a wonderful record. But Don Giovanni didn't write any book about his own conquest. And I think Kierkegaard is a man who decided to remain backstage in life. He also says that in his journal. He said that he was always an observer, observing the customs and ways of being of his contemporaries, but not engaging himself in anything except writing and except strolling in Copehagen. He was sitting at cafe and looking at people. And so he never had not 1,003 ladies, not even one. And that's extremely interesting. As I said before, he decided so to sacrifice his own life to redeem the sin of his father.
Right.
And this redemption is infinite. And
impossible to achieve.
And impossible to achieve. And but in this sacrifice, there is a huge pride, there is a huge vanity also. Because at the end of his life...
Vanity?
Yes, Kierkegaard thought of himself as the witness of God, as the envoy of God, as the poet of God, and
as a spokesperson
of God. And of course, this is a position which is not very easy to adopt, especially when you have an official church. That's why he spent the last years of his life attacking the Lutheran Church. But which is interesting in Kierkegaard's faith. And that's why we can read him even we are not believers.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because here you are in the past couple of weeks rereading Kierkegaard. You may have been a choir boy when you were 13 years old. You may have had a difficult upbringing when you were 16 years old in Lyon. But here you are a few years later reading Kierkegaard.
Many years later.
A few.
Yes, a few years, thank you. Yes.
A few years later, reading Kierkegaard, discovering how difficult it is and discovering maybe that it doesn't get easier with age. And you're reading him without any crutch or any help from religion. Quite on the contrary, you're reading him as someone who, if I may be so bold as to say, is a non-believer. Does it make sense to read Kierkegaard in such a secular, decontextualized way?
Yes, it makes sense for two reasons, for two different reasons. The first one is that Kierkegaard uses a rhetoric figure which is paradox. For instance, in his Treaty of Despair, he says, on one hand, he says, there is a sin not to believe in sin. It's a sin to despair about sin, but it's also a sin not to despair about sin. And it's a sin to despair as for the redemption of sin. So, you know, with him, you never know where you stand. You think you have understood one proposition, and then he takes the different standpoint. And that's why Kierkegaard is giving us as many arguments in favor of God and as many arguments against God. He says somewhere, I don't remember where he says, religion are like travel agencies that promise you a nice trip to the beyond, but nobody ever came back from heaven to say it was worth the trip. That's really the phrase of an atheist. So that's the first point. My second point, and
that's a fantastic line.
It's a fantastic line.
Can you say it again?
So he says that religions,
because I think it's important to,
are like travel agencies, which promise you a safe trip to the beyond, but nobody ever came back from heaven to tell you it was worth a trip. You understand?
I do understand.
I translated from the French.
No, I do understand, and
so,
I will.
You know, and why? It's because Kierkegaard has been a reluctant Christian in his first years. He finally decided to embrace theology, but had a lot of difficulties to get his diploma. And this doubt, you can feel it all over his writing until the end. And that's what's making him very interesting. Because as an atheist myself, I can read him with a lot of interest. And I think this is a great difference by the way, between Christianity and another religion like Islam. Christianity always includes, at least since Saint Augustin, Pascal, a dimension of doubt about the idea of God. Judaism also. God exists, but we don't know exactly under which form, and the promises he makes to us are not so certain after all. Whereas for the moment, Islam is one block of faith which nobody can challenge. And this uncertainty in Christianity, you can feel it in Kierkegaard speeches and books. The other reason for which we can read Kierkegaard nowadays in a de-Christianized world, I found it in communication which Jean-Paul Sartre made in 1966 in Paris at l'UNESCO, which is a UN cultural center.
It was a reunion.
It was a big reunion which gathered famous philosophers. There were Karl Jaspers, Gabriel Marcel, Emmanuel Levinas, Jean Val, and Jean-Paul Sartre. And Sartre speaks about the scene. And he said, me, as an atheist, I do not believe in sin, in original sin. And that's so amusing to read when you have read Sartre's books, because Sartre never ceases to inject shame and guilt in his reader's mind.
He never ceases.
Never ceases, yes.
Yeah. In other words, there is always shame.
There is always shame. There is the guilt.
La mauvaise foi, the bad face.
The bad face of the waiter in a cafe that plays to be a waiter. It's a bad face of each of us when we refuse our freedom and try to reify ourselves.
And like incidentally, I in remembering this scene from L'Être et le Néant, the garçon de café,
exactly, the waiter, yes.
Of the waiter, I was thinking that in a way, Sartre was a really good heir of Kierkegaard, because he really made philosophy palpable.
Yes,
he made it Romanesque. He made it like a novel.
Yes, exactly like Kierkegaard. Yes, and he made theater plays. He made novels. And you know, Baudelaire says some things that civilization is the abandonment of the original sin. But it's very interesting to note that we have, as secular people, reintroduced the original sin in every field of our life: personal success, love life, political life. And our appreciation of the West as a global culture is also marked by the original sin of capitalism, colonialism, slavery, our treatment of immigration. So also we proclaim not to be Christians anymore. The original sin, which has been so largely described by Kierkegaard, is still marking us deep in our souls.
Sadly, because we have little time left, and I could continue talking with you at least for 2 hours, and 2 hours with Siri, and 2 hours with René, and I hope you can all stay until about 9:30. But
we will, yes.
Sadly, I'll have a couple more questions, and then we'll call this our first Kierkegaard session. You know, it reminded me when you was talking about Baudelaire that he has this wonderful line I've always loved. He says that even if God didn't exist, it wouldn't be a good enough reason not to believe in him.
Yes, but in fact this is very Christian.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the most brilliant...
I mean, it comes to me as I look at you,
yes,
thinking this is interesting.
No, exactly. I think the most brilliant minds of Christianity always started with a doubt about the existence of God. And what is interesting in Christianity is that it starts with the death of God. It's the only religion which has killed God, of course, in order to have him resurrect 3 days after, which is a trick, which doesn't work. But, you know, when you have killed your own God, your own object of worship, then you can have a big doubt about the existence of God. And it's the same thing, of course, in Judaism. And maybe this is what makes nowadays Christianity and liberal Judaism so more agreeable to live, because it's a factor of cohesion, of coherence.
You know, it strikes me, Pascal, that you cannot not, I mean, I don't think you have it in you to not be a polemicist. you need to be a polemicist. And
yes, that's why I like Kierkegaard.
Yes,
because,
and so I was going to ask you, because I think in Kierkegaard there's a posturing. The dandy is a posturing. And I'm wondering if precisely you might be able to articulate why Kierkegaard matters to you as a polemicist, because you yourself are one.
Yes, he's a very brilliant polemicist, and he always writes with an enemy behind his shoulder. And of course,
and so do you.
Yes, yes, maybe 2 or 3, because you know they're still alive. But
do you know the line of Sartre, who said that he wrote, when he was asked why he wrote theatre, he said "pour donner la parole à mes ennemis," to give the word to my enemies.
Yeah.
Anyway, continue.
Yeah, but anyway, that's which is a very good attitude, because, as Sartre said, also you always have to think against yourself. But when you read Kierkegaard, you know, he alludes constantly, of course, to Hegel, but this is very well known, but also to more obscure philosophers of reverence of his time, against which he fights. And then when you have these moments of polemics, it awakens you, because you know it's like a sword. He crosses the sword through someone else's flesh, and you like him because it makes his writings very lively. You know, it's not an exposure of ideas or of an opinion. It's a polemic, and I think philosophy must be created through polemics.
Two more quick comments. One, since you grew up, as it were, under the guise of existentialism, there's one philosopher, not Sartre but Camus, who in the Myth of Sisyphus has this to say: Kierkegaard may shout in warning, if man had no eternal consciousness, if at the bottom of everything there were merely a wild, seizing force producing everything, both large and trifling, in the storm of dark passions, if the bottomless void that nothing can fill underlay all things, that what would life be but despair? This cry is not likely to stop the absurd man. Seeking what is true is not seeking what is desirable. If in order to elude the anxious question, what would life be, one must, like the donkey, feed on the roses of illusion, then the absurd mind, rather than resigning itself to falsehood, prefers to adopt fearlessly Kierkegaard's reply: despair. Everything considered, a determined soul will always manage. I'm wondering if you feel sympathetic to this view of Camus.
Well, I don't feel antipathic, at least, but I'm not sure to understand it exactly. But yes, you can start your own life with despair and then embrace it with passion. Kierkegaard says something in his book, The Concept of Anguish. He said that we fear and we flee anguish as much as we love it, but we can never love it because we have to flee it. And this is exactly, I think, the definition of freedom, which is a very tempting movement, which at the same time you're afraid to commit yourself into. Of course, Kierkegaard stayed on the edge. He never went into life, you know. He adopted, as I said before, the situation of the observer. And
un spectateur non engagé,
yes,
non-engaged.
Non-engaged spectator. But at the end of his life, he seems in his journal to regret his attitude. And
to be a bystander.
Yeah, bystander, and obviously friendship, love, passion, whenever his main pleasures. But we can read Kierkegaard and then commit ourselves, engage ourselves into ordinary life without losing our souls.
Without becoming a double of him.
Yeah, without becoming a double of him. But we do not all have fatherly sins to atone for.
Thankfully. In closing, I'm going to be doing a little experiment. You mentioned that Kierkegaard really works well as a number of quotations, as a number of moments that are important. And I suffer from a terrible disease, which all of you will be privy to this afternoon, which is I suffer from something called quotomania. I seem not to be able to stop quoting. It's a disease from which I wish no cure, but I suffer from it quite deeply. And I think we try different quotations to try out different reactions also from different people and to see how we feel about that very quotation. And, you know, when I mentioned the Camus, it didn't have an enormous amount of resonance, but now mentioning this Kierkegaard, you may say, oh my goodness, this means something to me that is very strong. To me, this is sort of at the basis, nearly at the core of a certain form of thinking in Kierkegaard, an existentialist form. And this is what he says, and we can maybe put on the stage the line that you saw as you came in. I will read it slowly so you have time to see it. My soul has lost possibility. It comes from the Diapsalmata in either or. My soul has lost possibility. Were I to wish for anything, I would not wish for wealth and power, but for the passion of the possible, that eye which everywhere, ever young, ever burning, sees possibility. Pleasure disappoints, not possibility. And what wine is so sparkling, what's so fragrant, so intoxicating? C'est pas mal, huh?
Yes, it's not bad. You know, the quotomania is very often a fear to speak in your own, as a first person.
You know,
I have it too.
But you know, I'll tell you, when you interview me next, you can talk to me about that.
Exactly.
Because I do need help.
No, I will help you, Paul.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. It's a mask.
No, it's not a mask. It's a way to protect oneself, I think.
I say it's a mask.
Yes.
No, you go ahead.
Take off your mask and speak,
you can speak
in your own mind.
Yeah.
What you say, this quotation is a beautiful one. It reminds me, by the way, of note by Brassailles, the photographer, and he tells a story about the young Marcel Proust. When Marcel Proust was a young man, he fell in love with the son of a magistrate in Geneva. And of course, nothing happened. It was a pure possible. And the young man sent a picture of himself to Marcel Proust, and he had written on this, at the back of this picture, a poem by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And the line was, look at my face, my name is might have been, I'm also called too late, no more, farewell. And it's a beautiful quotation. And
you know it by heart.
And I know it by heart, yes. I know it by heart because I repeated it to myself many times in French and in English. And
in different circumstances.
In different circumstances, yes. And I think this is Kierkegaard's tragedy. He's someone who has always preferred the possibility to the reality. And so he never engaged himself in any kind of concrete road except writing his books for fear to miss another opportunity. And this explains also the special tonality of his work. But you could comment your quotation in a different way. We remain alive, whatever our age is, as long as we still have different possibilities around us. And life is finished when the roads are not bifurcating anymore, when there is just one path to the end. And so for me, Kierkegaard remains this wonderful oxygen which opens many ways to different kinds of life. That's why he remains, for me at least, a capital contemporary.
Pascal Bruckner, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Hein.
Okay.
Formidable, formidable.
Thank you. Where do I sit?